Greetings, I'm Shad, and I'm here at Caerphilly Castle, and they have a room here with some examples of medieval furniture, and it's worth having a dedicated video to show you because Caerphilly isn't the only castle that actually has some examples of medieval furniture. I hope to be able to show you some other examples at other castles that I'm going to see as I travel through Britain. But right here is a great example because it doesn't really look like what a lot of people would expect when they think of medieval furniture. Medieval people loved colours, okay? They loved patterns, they showed it on the walls, and they showed it in the furniture, and that's what a lot of people don't really realise. Look at the colour of that bed right there, okay? It's quite bright and garish, a bit more garish than we might appreciate in the modern day, but we have a different sense of style than they had in the medieval period. This is what a noble bed and a noble chair would have actually looked like.
More specifically, what they would have looked like in the early medieval period for the high nobility. As I'll show you later on in the video, it was actually quite common for furniture to be polished timber in the high to late medieval period.
We often think chairs like that, and especially when they're depicted in movies, are stained timber, polished, nice and you know, sometimes dark brown depending on the stain that's added. When no, that's actually not the case. If you were noble, right, they would be painted and they'd be colourful. And it's pretty cool. And I wish I could see I guess a movie, film, TV show that depicted medieval furniture more accurately. Stuff like what we see here. And this is only a couple of examples. We hope to see some more examples as we travel across Britain. This chair here is an interesting bit of both accuracy and inaccuracy. The overall shape is very accurate to a medieval style chair, but with the people who were remaking this castle, well, a lot of the surviving medieval furniture, all the painted faded away, and so they've polished it up to reflect an aesthetic of about the 19th century, where furniture was kind of polished timber. And yes, it looks nice, but if you're actually looking at this style of furniture, especially fancy chairs, well, in the medieval period, as we saw at Caerphilly Castle, if they were fancy chairs, they were often painted.
The thing is though, we don't want to go too far with this explanation or representation of painted furniture in the medieval period. It was certainly done especially for the fancy upper class examples, but not for the entirety of the medieval period. In actual fact, as I look at primary sources from medieval art, we can see many examples of unpainted timber furniture in the high to late medieval period. So much so that it seems like painted furniture is more representative of the early medieval period upper class furniture. But it was actually far more common in the high to late medieval period that furniture was actually polished timber, but often adorned with a type of coloured or brocaded cloth over top.
Okay, this is one of the upper rooms of the primary tower, and it is stunning. And again, this is an extremely medieval style room. I'm not kidding. Like the patterns and designs and colours, I'm seeing very little Renaissance or later aesthetic design. I mean, take a look at it. Oh, wow. Now, maybe the mirrors at the top, that's hard to tell. I'd say that's probably not fully medieval, but the paintings in each one of these kind of square sections, yeah. Though the paintings themselves don't have a medieval kind of style. And so in medieval painting, it has an interesting style to the proportions and stuff where the monkeys actually are a little higher quality than what you would usually find in medieval artwork. That's one of the things that floors me about this room, like really, is the furniture. This is such a glorious representation of a noble medieval bed. So this would be the bed of a nobleman, someone rich, basically. And look at the colour. Look at the painting that they have done on this. This is gorgeous. And I've actually read that this is based off of a 13th century bed. I'm not sure how comfortable that chair would be, though. But something that floored me is this. I think it's an armoire. Look at the design and painting on it. Absolutely gorgeous, and that's what they would look like if you were rich and in the medieval period. Like, do you see the level of colour and pattern work there? This is stunning. This is incredible. Oh, I'm in love with it. This is such a beautiful room. Okay, so small little things, I have to nitpick, okay? We do have larger windows facing the outside, which is interesting because we have a larger window and also an arrow loop right next to it, when really you would want them all to be arrow loops unless you had windows facing the inside of the Bailey. You get away with something like that. Now, it's not to say there weren't exceptions with larger windows facing the outside, and this is high enough, so maybe, yeah, you could get away with it. But also, like, in terms of the details, see each alcove how it has like a dedicated pillar built into the stonework, and these are pointed arches, so it's Gothic in design. And then how the fire just naturally sits in one of those arches, right? This might be my favorite room, honestly, in terms of its accuracy, but also the furniture really kicks it over the edge. This is unbelievable. I am in love. This is amazing. And again, I was expecting it to be more a blend with 18th century interpretation of what medieval design was. Well, from my research, and I've looked at a lot of medieval art and everything like this is far more medieval than it is 19th century interpretation of it. There's for instance, see the patterns, how they're in squares along the walls here? Very, very medieval. So in terms of medieval pattern design, they often repeated a lot of shapes and images and stuff. This goes the same with the armoire right here. Do you see how a lot of squares, cross-hatching, as well as repeated kind of imagery? That's a very medieval style and aesthetic. And we see, look at the flowers. Look at the flowers right here above the thing. Repeated images, and usually they'd be able to paint these with stencils. They'd actually have a stencil, and it could be made out of leather or even a thick type of parchment, and they would have that thing and they'll paint over it and stencil on the pattern.
This week's exclusive video is a discussion on sabres and if I like them or don't. But what you also might be interested to see in our backlog of exclusive content is the video Medieval vs Gothic from my UK trip. Only available to our supporters, and you can get access to that and all of our exclusive content for as little as $1 a month. And that is through Subscribestar, Patreon, or channel memberships. We can't stress enough that it is only thanks to our supporters that we're able to make this content. We are basically supporter funded at this time, and so if you'd like access to this exclusive content as well as support Shadowversity to keep making content in the future, as well as seeing unreleased footage from my UK trip which will be coming out as exclusives in the future, please become a supporter, and it means more to us than we can express. So I'm here at Trattowwa Court, and there's also a castle here to be seen as well. And one of the most stunning things about this location right here is that they have recreated a very authentic and historically accurate banquet hall. And one of the things that I absolutely love, which I've mentioned already in videos, is the wall carpets. Now, it's hard to say exactly, because there's a number of ways you can describe them, as in hanging carpets, hanging tapestries, wall brocades, so feel free to use anyone. I think I'll just call them wall carpets, but we see these depicted in art all the time on interiors. And I've been able to see a number of medieval rooms recreated, and this is the first one I've come to that actually has authentic wall carpets. Usually they might do a whitewash or they might do murals on the walls and things, but this is actually one of the more common ways of decorating both their rooms but also the banquet halls. Now, not only is this just so great to see in terms of having the wall carpets, but this is a very authentic recreation on many levels. Having a look at just the legs here on the table, do you see how the Lord's table, they're painted? And also interesting, here on the Lord's table, they have metal kind of plates, and this might even be pewter, it's hard to say exactly, but they have metal dining, utensils, where on the lower tables, they are a bit more plain wood and ceramic. And so small details like that are absolutely phenomenal. And if you have a look up, because this is a 14th century building we're standing in right now, have a look at that timberwork. That is just stunning stuff. And so we're in the kind of manor house, and it's a bit of a fortified manor house here, and I think it's pronounced Trattowwa, and there's a castle out there to be seen as well. But what an absolutely stunning and
gorgeous representation of something that I've seen in art so much and rarely seen recreated. So the people who decked out this hall to make it look as authentic and historical as possible, they did their research. And then, of course, we have a more elaborate it would either be brocaded or painted on the cloth, and this one is painted on the cloth. And not just patterns, but as you see, actual kind of artworks. And as I might have mentioned already in the video, it's hard to say, but the utility of it mainly, I feel, is for decoration. Secondary, it could be for extra insulation, and the advantage is if you ever wanted to move or relocate and this was one of your favorite kind of, patterns on the wall, you can take it down and put it up where you want it. And so this isn't just something that we see in feasting halls, it's also something that we see in bedrooms and a lot of rooms inside both manor houses and castles. And there might have been another purpose for them in terms of creating a division in the alcoves, which would have made a separate type of room. I want to speculate and talk a little bit about these beautiful alcoves because they're a little romantic almost. They are a bit more private, a bit more separated from the rest of the room. And as a result, it makes me wonder how they would have been used in regards to the rest of the room. In fact, take a look at what one of these window alcoves looks like in pristine condition. I'm right now at Castle Koch, and this is a great example of one of these window alcoves when it's plastered and painted with cushions on the side. Now this one in particular has a much larger window here, letting in more light, but you can still imagine what it would be like with perhaps an arrow loop, like what you're seeing at Caerphilly Castle. And it is such a cozy, comfortable little section. And again, with like a curtain partition, sealing it off, it actually make a really private little addition to a room that's actually on the smaller scale compared to the other bedrooms of a castle. And I sometimes wonder, with alcoves like this, if you really wanted privacy, you could hang a curtain or a wall carpet right in front to get complete privacy. And if you were having a full family living here, you would have a bed for the mother and father, and usually a separate bed, sometimes a trundle that would roll out for the children. And if you even have up to 3 children, they'd often be sleeping out of the same bed. And that is for important people, even nobility that are related to the lord of the castle. And it's a good example because you have this fireplace which would increase warmth, livability, and it gives you some idea of other things that they could have put in here. But if this was a room with people living out of, there'd be even more furnishings. But look, yes, a table to either eat or do activities. They did enjoy board games in the medieval period, by the way. And also what we see here is a type of fire grate of some type, which lifts the fire from the stone, which just helps protect the stone from the main fire. The coals and ashes will fall through, and don't need to be cleaned and stuff like that, but the actual burning core of the fire would be lifted off. So I'm here at Cardiff Castle, and there's actually a great representation of painted on stonework. So this wall would have been plastered and of course painted, but what we see here is then on top of that, it actually got a pattern or painted on brickwork to make it actually look like it's fancier dressed stone. And it even goes into the archways that we see above here. This was actually decently common because you rarely ever see rough stone like we see on many of the castles where the whitewash has deteriorated and you see the rough stone. And it actually looks pretty good, and at a distance you might almost think of it as somewhat convincing. But it's interesting because Cardiff Castle is a bit of a Gothic revival, 18th century interpretation of what medieval interior decorating was like, the fashion and stuff. But this room here is decently accurate to what a lot of interior rooms would have been like in the medieval period. This painted and then fake painted on brickwork over top. So I'm inside the Banquet Hall of Castle Koch, and this one actually is quite impressive in how authentic it is. This very well could be a 13th century banquet hall with only 1 or 2 little oddities, but some of the things that is perfectly accurate is what they've done here. So the actual stone has a plaster over top, and then they paint stuff on top, and what they've done, they've actually painted brickwork, and then they've painted patterns on that brickwork. And this kind of painted brickwork is all along the walls. And then above that brickwork, we have murals and paintings, very religiously inspired. These ones look to be of certain saints. Something that is not accurate to the medieval period is actually all the portraits. Instead of hanging, paintings on the walls, well, they usually just paint directly onto the walls itself. Now, this room, you were saying, is mostly untouched. This is very much close to its 14th century.
Pretty much, yes. A lot of the other tower rooms are modified in the more modern era, the Victorian era, for example. Whereas this room, for some strange reason, the founder didn't want to touch it. It was open to the public for a while, so there was a bit more modern graffiti in here, but for the most part, it was just left closed off. And that's why in this particular room, we do have graffiti dating back to the 14th century.
Yeah. One of the things that really stands out to me, is it does not look like there's any original plasterwork on the walls. Now, in a lot of the castles we've visited, I've been paying a specific attention to plaster on walls. And I've also mentioned that it wasn't universal. When they didn't have plaster on walls, it was usually because the stone was fancy. It was well fitted and properly dressed, nice looking stone, because that's what we see in medieval art. Mm-hmm. When you see bare stone in medieval art, the type of stone you see is what we're standing in right now. This is actually a gorgeous example of what a bare stone room would have looked like an upper class bare stone room, because these stones are very smooth, and they're so smooth, in fact, I had to take a double take. I was thinking, was this restored? Because there's so little weathering on it. But Ben, you mentioned, no, this is actually 14th century.
They kept it as because the windows themselves would have been wooden shutters or lancets. So
yes.
The elements would have been kept away from the room. So the sandstone itself, it's all Triassic sandstone. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to cut, easy to shape. Mm-hmm. It will weather quite easily as well, but as long as the room is kept wind-free and dry, not a problem. And it's nice and warm in here as well.
It genuinely really surprised me. So because we look here, see how well fitted the stones are one to another, And it looks so nice that you don't need to plaster it. You don't need to wash it. A lot of the walls that we saw in a lot of the other castles, it was very mismatched, kind of messy stonework, so you can see why they would want to plaster it. If you're more wealthy to afford painting, your furniture, and not only furniture, walls as well. If this room was seen in the medieval period, it would have been whitewashed, plastered, and we actually see some of the original plaster still on the wall here. Do you see this? This is original plaster on the wall right there. And so that shows you that this room originally was fully plastered all the way around and would have been whitewashed, and it would look pretty stunning as a result.
But also take note of the type of stone we can see now that the plaster is worn off. Smaller brickwork, mismatched, not dressed or smooth or fitted together with nearly the level of precision that we can observe on stone that was made to be seen as the primary surface of the wall.
Oh, that has the hooks! Oh my gosh! It has the hooks that they would hang the tapestries and wall carpets on, still on the walls. Oh my gosh, that's a treat. I have not seen that yet. I need to just geek out about these here, because this is undeniable evidence that they had wall hanging tapestries in this room, just like what we've seen in medieval art. I've only seen one castle that actually had, a recreation of a medieval room that had wall tapestries. And it's so unknown. Few people really realise that was a very common way that people decorated their rooms. And so seeing the hooks there to hang them on, and you can see them over here as well. Oh my gosh, that's a treat. In contrast to the more authentic medieval interiors we've been able to show, I'm here standing in one of the guest suites of Warwick Castle, and it's actually a perfect representation of what people think medieval interiors looked like. And it's the result of multiple influences, styles from the Renaissance as well as Gothic revival, where many things are blended together and is representative of certain things I've already pointed out. For instance, what you'll see is wood panelling right along here. This was not very common. It's not very commonly depicted in medieval art, but it's very common on the Gothic Revival type of interiors. The next interesting thing are the types of colours in the curtains as well as on the bed. See how they're kind of a muted palette, where they're a bit more washed out? This wasn't common with medieval colours that were used to decorate interiors. They were usually very vibrant and bright. It would be a stronger green or blue or red. The furniture is an interesting example, and this looks gorgeous.
And it's actually a good example of what later period polished timber furniture looked like in the medieval period. In fact, here is an example from medieval art of a polished timber cupboard as well.
One interesting thing about enclosed beds is that if you actually wanted an enclosed bed for the purpose of trapping the heat in, it would be smaller. All right. The smaller it is, the more easier it is for your own body heat to kind of radiate and warm up that space. And so enclosed beds were actually about as wide. And when I say enclosed, again, it's for the purpose of keeping yourself warm. They're about as wide as single beds that we have in the modern day, and not as tall. They were shorter, and they were more box-like to actually trap in the heat. This, what we see here, this glorious four-poster bed, is not necessarily for practical purposes of keeping the heat in. It's because it looks amazing, and it does. It looks absolutely incredible, but shouldn't really be taken as stereotypical for the medieval period. The other thing to mention that is usually perceived as medieval styling, again, furniture. This is not a medieval style chair. They were usually more box-like, sometimes thinner, it varied, and of course the chair that we have over here in the corner is obviously not a medieval chair. This is like 18th century and stuff. I love this mirror. This mirror is absolutely gorgeous. Doesn't strike me as medieval either. Another thing to comment on is the wall. So I have mentioned that wood paneling. I've seen three cases in art of wood paneling, not necessarily of this type. What was far more stereotypical was whitewash and painted walls, wall tapestries or wall carpets, or dressed stone that actually looked nice on the inside. And that's actually kind of what we see here. We see some really nice, precise dressed stone all the way around. A beautiful vaulted ceiling. And even though a bit weathered, this still looks pretty darn neat. And so I think it would be almost neat enough to pass for wanting to present as a feature inside a room. And so not necessarily would this have been whitewashed. I mean, this is so smooth, it obviously hasn't weathered or aged, so this was part of a repair or reconstruction, this window alcove here. But it's actually a good representation of the type of smooth kind of dressed stone that would warrant it not being whitewashed and plastered, to just have the stone stand out as a feature, and what it would have more looked like, closer to when it was made. And so dressed fancy stone of the medieval period, this is probably far more representative. Don't mind the glass lead light. Is it lead light? I forget the exact name for this diamond pattern style. That's actually more, again, a Renaissance thing. If medieval windows did have glass, it was usually really fancy. We're talking stained glass windows and things like that. Though there might be cases of this style of window in the medieval period. It's ringing a bell, but I'd need to double check that one. The thing is, though, they're not very common. What was far more common on windows like this would be a wooden shutter. Just a thing that you can open up, let the light in, let the cool air in, and when you wanted to close it to keep the heat in, wooden shutter would be over top. Of course, these big curtains, I haven't seen any cases of curtains like this in the medieval period. Curtains like this, not very common, but what's interesting, the pattern itself is actually quite an authentic style of brocade that would not be uncommon to see on medieval wall carpets or wall tapestries. And so instead of having them hang as curtains, what would be more common is have these, and we've seen examples already in this video, right, actually hung along the walls itself. So for fantasy, this room, perfect, go to town, it is gorgeous. But if you're wanting something more accurate, medieval accurate, you should know the differences. And no, this is not a medieval room, but it is a gorgeous room. Here at Warwick Castle, we're standing in the state bedroom, and there's something really interesting to note. It is the tapestries on the wall here. And I was talking to Ben, who was being our guide throughout Warwick Castle, and you've identified that these are not actually medieval tapestries, though.
No, they're from 1604, so yeah, quite later than medieval, but they are still beautiful. And by then, the tapestry design had become its peak, you could say. These depict palace gardens. There's even some Greek influence in there. It's the story of Ovid's Metamorphoses, where a young lad was spying on a woman getting naked in a bath. And the gods thought, you can't have that, and they turned him into a stag.
Well, there you go. Now, what's interesting is to show that even in later periods, they were still hanging carpets, basically, on walls as a type of decoration. You could almost consider this as a historical type of wallpaper. Now, what's also interesting to point out, for me, is a strong distinction between what you would identify as a tapestry and maybe a wall carpet or a hanging cloth or a brocade of some type. And so tapestry really is what we're seeing here, where it's depicting a scene. It's got a lot of artistry and work put into it, versus a lot of the medieval type of wall hangings. They were more, they were the occasional tapestry, but more often than not, they were a type of brocade or pattern or just plain colours, like strips of colours. And so I wouldn't really call those tapestries. I would call those hanging carpets or hanging brocades or just wall carpets or wall cloths. There's a number of descriptive ways. But it's great to see what walls look like with tapestries on them, even if they're not necessarily medieval, they're later period. They just look stunning. So after the state bedroom, we're now in the dressing room, which was also evolved to be a lady's boudoir at one point.
It was, yeah.
What's really interesting is what we see on the walls right here. Okay, this is a silk cloth, essentially, but it's more permanently affixed to the wall. And it's a great example of the transitional kind of evolution from the medieval wall hangings, from wall carpets to wall tapestries and stuff, to then that eventually becomes wallpaper. But before you reach wallpaper, you have wall silk, essentially, which is a patterned brocade permanently affixed to the wall, which is functionally very similar to wallpaper, but it was made out of cloth. And you can see that evolution. So we're now standing in what was, I guess, the main living quarters?
It was the apartments of the family in their later years, by the 1950s, 1960s.
And so what's also very interesting, because we're now in much later periods, is we see the final evolution of that wall decoration. We are now onto wallpaper, basically. What I find interesting in this period, still very distinct, almost medieval patterns on the wall. So they still appreciate the same design style, but the technology evolved where we had hanging carpets to tapestries to actual, I guess, carpet silks attached to the wall permanently. Now, wallpaper, which is much easier to make and put on the walls.
And there we go. These are all the examples I was able to see in person while visiting Britain of what medieval castles actually looked like on the inside. Please be sure to drop a like. It helps out more than I can express with this video's reach. And stay tuned for Shadiversity for more medieval content, whether that's about swords, castles, or testing out random fun things. Thank you for watching, and until next time, farewell.